Okay, so welcome. Looks like we've got quite a few people joining. I'll just give it a moment. So welcome to this webinar, which is being run by the Financial and Professional Services Committee at IOSH. We have run various subjects so far this year. Today's subject is going to be on the Building Safety Act. And I'd like to welcome Peter, Amir, and Christian to take you through the key elements of the Building Safety Act. My name is Simon Pullen. I'm standing in as chair for this particular call. Please use the question and answers box to raise any questions, which the panel will attempt to either answer. If we can answer particular questions through this session, any questions that we can't, we'll put a link at the end to our page where we will put a summary of various questions and create a frequently answered question sheet. Please do not raise your hands as part of the program, because we cannot see them while we're presenting. And we would like you to use the Q&A to create, record any questions. Peter, in just a moment, I'll hand you over to Peter. Peter's had 30 years of experience in health and safety, and the last 15 years in the built environment. He is the Managing Director at ARC Workplace Risk Assessment. He's a member of IOSH, a chartered member of IOSH, and he's also on the peer review panel at IOSH. So welcome, Peter, to this engaging presentation.
Thank you. Well, I hope it's going to be engaging anyway, but I appreciate the introduction. Yes, so Building Safety Act, it's a huge piece of legislation. So I'm not going to go into detail on every section of the Act, but it's going to be an overview. And it's going to look at fire and structural risk in the built environment. So as per the introduction, I'm the Managing Director of ARC Workplace Risk. The presentation will, just a trigger warning, the presentation will contain some images, non-graphic images of some fatal building fires and structural collapses. So with that in mind, I will continue. Hopefully this is all working okay and you can see my screen. So as I say, the Building Safety Act 2022, huge piece of legislation for safety in the built environment. So we'll look at it today in part. There's 340 pages in the Building Safety Act, and with 30 pieces of secondary legislation associated with the Act, I'm just going to look at some of the key changes that it's brought in. There's over 1,000 pages to go through. I'll look at the effect of the Building Safety Act on planning, and for those people involved in that process at the moment, this is going to be, I think it's a fairly interesting time, shall we say, for you. I'll look at the regulatory framework around the Act, what it's come in to do, what it's trying to do, and what it kind of links to that we've already got. We'll do a little bit on fire and structural risk, just understanding those key elements with regards to the Building Safety Act and higher risk buildings. And we'll look at strategies for mitigating those types of risk. We'll touch on the role of technology, which I'm sure you're all kind of very well versed on, but the role of technology in managing safety risk is huge at the moment. So we'll touch on that. I'll look at the new stakeholders. There's some incredible changes in terms of who is accountable now, and we'll look at that. I'm going to try and do a bit of horizon scanning, the future of building safety legislation. It is at the moment in flux. It's a fascinating time to be working in the built environment. I say that I do a lot of these sorts of webinars, and I say that, and depending on the audience, I get this kind of either a grimace or a kind of a nodding smile. It is an incredible time. There's a lot going on at the moment. It's putting an awful lot of accountability quite rightly where it belongs. I'll finish up with some international insights, so just a very brief look at what this could mean internationally, because I know we've got a lot of international people on the call as well. Post-Grenfell, the legislation had to evolve, didn't it? You know, to enhance building safety, increase that accountability. If we look at what's happened post-Grenfell, you know, and that the investigations and the inquiries, we needed strict regulations. There were 72 fatalities in that fire. We owe it to those people to do what we're doing now as safety professionals and fix those things that were wrong leading up to that. Are we going to do it? It's 7 years since Grenfell. We haven't done it yet. Are we going to do it? Well, I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that this is the start of what's going to come next. You know, as I say, it's a very complex piece of legislation. I'm going to have a very high level look at it on this webinar. We've got an hour. I'm going to try and leave some time for questions. I'm sure there will be some, but it is intricate. I'm going to look at some of the mitigation for these fire and structural risks that we now should be aware of. I'm going to look at some best practices for risk management. I also touch again on those kind of advancements in safety technologies. My area of activity in art workplace risk is in the in-use safety management of residential buildings. So the webinar is going to focus on that. So I will touch on planning and that you know, pre-construction phase. But if we need to go deeper into that, it will probably be another webinar. In fact, most of the slides could be a webinar in their own right. And again, as I said, I'm looking at, this is UK-based legislation. Now, it's not even UK-wide at the moment. So the implications for our international colleagues is very, very interesting. Okay, so let's look at the Act. Post-Grenfell reform is the order of the day with this Act. So from the very early days of the Building Safety Bill, we knew what was coming. So this was established in response to the Grenfell Tower fire and the systematic failures therein. It relates to HRBs. It's a new, I'll probably be throwing around some acronyms. Some you might know, some you might not, but please let me know if they need explaining. And I'll try and do that as I go along if I remember. But a higher risk building is now defined under the Building Safety Act as an 18-metre plus building or 7 stories or more that contains 2 or more dwellings. So very straightforward, you'd think, but with that comes the law of unintended consequences. So it brings into play an awful lot of buildings that previously would have gone under the radar potentially. So you know, particularly a 7-story building. We've had a lot in the news recently about a 6-story building that is now a first-tier tribunal found that actually should come under the Building Safety Act as a 7-story building because it has a roof garden. Now, the Building Safety Regulator, and I'll talk more about those in a moment, are going to argue against that. But we'll look at that confusion and how it's going to play out over the next couple of weeks, months, and years. So it's designed to provide a comprehensive safety framework, so designed to enhance safety standards and particularly focus on these high-rise residential buildings and the unique risks therein. It doesn't just focus on those, it does in the main, but I'll also talk about where else it looks. It gives us some clear duty holders for the first time, really. It gives us duty holders that would previously not have been duty holders, that have been kind of brought into this. Why? Because they need to be. They are agents in the safety of those buildings. So this is developers, designers, building owners. So this is designed to ensure accountability. It gave us the creation of the Building Safety Regulator. This is an independent body, part of the Health and Safety Executive, designed to oversee that compliance and enforce, conduct inspections, enhance oversight across our sector. It brings sharp focus on fire and structural safety. It brings in the requirement for regular assessments, both fire risk assessments and structural risk assessments. It brings in the resident voice, and I can't stress enough how loud that resident voice is now. So if you think back to where this started, and you think back to Grenfell, and the lack of voice of the residents, they were noisy. They were perceived as problems. They were perceived as disruptive. They were ignored. If I don't know if you can see me holding this, but this is a book, Show Me the Bodies, by Peter Abt. I highly recommend, if you don't know a great deal about Grenfell, reading and starting with that, and it gives you that picture of why the residents' voice was so crucial. Had they listened to them, we may not be on this webinar today. Ultimately, what the Act is designed to do is foster a cultural shift, a long-term cultural change. Dame Judith Hackett said some very damning things about the construction industry, about the built environment industry. She said we're in a race to the bottom, you know, and that led to Grenfell, and she was largely right. So what this Act does in part, and its secondary legislation, is look at that cultural change that's required, bringing around that commitment to transparent practices. So some of the key changes, so the major provisions of the Act, you know, as I've talked about there, it's in ensuring, or designed to ensure, rigorous building standards. Accountability is key as well. So we'll look a bit later at the people now who are accountable. We'll look at risk assessment. You know, it's now you know, it addresses fire safety, but it also addresses structural safety and structural integrity. Now that's key. Now that's something that was missing, and this is also a very interesting point, because the Building Safety Act was born essentially of the Grenfell Tower disaster, which was fire related. However, the opportunity was seized to bring in structural integrity. I think it's something that has been lurking in the background. If you talk to structural engineers, they will talk about this all day long, that the structural integrity of building has been overlooked for too long, use of poor quality materials, etc. So those risk assessments for structural integrity are now part of the Building Safety Act. Section 86 tells us exactly what we should do. But that section also makes provision for more assessments. So again, we'll look at the future legislation a little bit later on in this webinar, but it tells us a bit of a story about where we're going. So we've got fire, we've got structure, but we're not going to ignore everything else. We're not going to ignore asbestos or Legionella. We're just going to get focused and start this process. But it mandates this structural integrity assessments. It also introduces these new people to the playing field. We've got new accountabilities, new stakeholders. So when the reform order in 2005 gave us the responsible person, the Building Safety Act has given us the accountable person. These two things, the responsible person is still there, they've not gone anywhere, but it's such an interesting appointment. The accountable person, or where there are more than one, the principal accountable person is actually the key player now. It's the key stakeholder. So what's their relationship with that responsible person? Well, in a high-rise residential building, it's normally their relationship will be one of master and servant. It would be the responsible person will be the managing agent in that building, typically. So now we've got that accountable person. The master and servant roles have to disappear, and we have to be more collaborative. We've got stakeholders now that require to work together. Now, your managing agent, a typical managing agent, typically we work with managing agents that know an awful lot about building safety. They work in, you know, in very structured and formulaic ways. They're skillful. They've been doing this a long time. And the property manager of today is a very different animal to the property manager pre-Grenfell. They are very, very focused on the safety within their buildings. The accountable person, or the principal accountable person, less so. Why? Because it's typically not what they've done before. So these people have owned the buildings. They've taken the rent, essentially. They've maybe built them as well. They may be partly developers. But now the accountability lies with them. And it's been a very, very interesting transition. Helped by the establishment of the Building Safety Regulator. So we're very happy to work with the Building Safety Regulator. They're going through an awful lot of change at the moment as well. From establishment to where they are today, there's been some changes at the top. There's been some changes of direction. The thing I like most about the Building Safety Regulator is the fact that they are themselves accountable, and they know that, and they talk a lot about you know, who they are, why they're there. They're not ashamed or embarrassed to say when they get things wrong as well. Everybody's learning here, aren't they? You know, it's just why we're on this webinar. Everybody is learning, including the Building Safety Regulator. So the building safety regulator, they enforce accountability amongst those duty holders. They design to promote the culture of safety within buildings. We're not just talking about in-use buildings, we're talking about the life cycle of the buildings as well, from planning through to demolition. You know, that whole life cycle is important. The building safety regulator will talk about building safety management systems. They will talk about, one of the things that they admit that they got wrong was they assumed that building safety management systems were a thing. They assumed that a higher risk building, these towers with hundreds of people living in them, would have these systems. And they typically don't. Some do, but typically they don't. So the regulator now is learning and understanding those sorts of things, and supporting and providing guidance. They understand the difficulties that we all face in this industry. One of those I've touched on now, and I will just touch on it, and I won't get into too much detail, but planning in the Building Safety Act. And I think if you know, you know. So if you're involved with planning, that you'll understand the gateways 1, 2, and 3. You'll understand that the building safety regulator has taken over that role of that will previously have been done by sort of local authorities, for example, and now they are approving planning applications through gateways. These are designed, obviously, to enhance that safety. Again, everything is about improvement and accountability in the construction of high-risk buildings. So there's 3 gateways. So gateway 1 is that planning application stage. So the focus here is that we get things right from the start. That building meets safety standards before planning permission is granted, it's submitted. This includes considerations of fire safety and structural integrity in the design process. So there's an awful lot of hoops to jump through right from the start, quite rightly so too. So we've seen a lot. The effect of this is interesting. We've seen a lot of news recently about 2 staircases in buildings and the requirement for 2 staircases. So we've also seen planning applications for single staircase buildings, high-rise residential buildings rejected. There's a whole webinar in that, and we may do that one day if there's enough interest, but there's a whole webinar in that, that kind of that reliance on a panacea like a double staircase. Is this a political football, or are we actually missing a point here? But that gateway 1 transfers into gateway 2. Again, we're pre-construction here. And that's the message, I guess, from these gateways, is that getting things right before we start is crucial. Getting things right means getting the design right, getting the structural integrity correct, getting the materials correct. So there's now new legislation, secondary legislation to the Building Safety Act, which brings in requirements for material testing, which again, you'd think in an industry like ours that this would have been there already. It wasn't. It's there now. So developers have got to submit that safety information. They've got to look at the types of material that they're using. Where does this come from? I mean, I think if we look at Grenfell, we look at what happened Grenfell, we look at not just Grenfell but similar incidents, and we see a pattern emerging of a lack of change management. So at ARC, we work with a lot of fantastic clients across the country doing various different things. So one of the interesting things that we did recently was a very tall, partly residential building, and we were asked to review the fire strategy for the building and retrospectively write a new one. So this was an interesting project for us, and also to write a safety case report, and I'll talk about those in a moment as well. This was an interesting one because the only excellent document was a fire strategy which dated from 6 years before that building was occupied, and it didn't take into account the fact that in this huge building there are now 23 stories of hotel accommodation. It just wasn't in the strategy. So, but the building got built, it got occupied, it got used, and it's a very safe building now, but you can see the problems that can arise from something like that. So then that final gateway is that completion stage. Now, this is the one that at ARC we get involved with an awful lot. So we have clients that are at gateway 3. They've got a building that is practical completion. At practical completion, they hand over a series of documents to their managing agent. So the managing agent now has got a legal duty to accept those documents and write back to the owner of the building and say, I've got them, they all make sense, They all work, and I'm happy with them. Places a lot of accountability on someone there that's maybe not used to that type of thing. So we're getting involved a lot here and having a look, and it's an eye-opening moment when you're looking at Gateway 3. So if you think of the Regulation 38 documentation that it's got to come across. I was with a group of people yesterday talking about the Building Safety Act, and someone said quite logically, well, look, if these experts have given you these documents, shouldn't you just be trusting the experts? And I think to a degree you should be, but that verification piece at Gateway 3 is crucial, because one of the examples I gave was of a sprinkler system in a building. So what we're looking for at this stage is that the sprinkler system is suitable and sufficient for the type of building, that it's been installed correctly in the right areas, and that it's been commissioned and is working as designed. So you think fairly straightforward exercise there to get those certificates and to review them with the fire strategy. And that is a straightforward exercise. But what we found with this was they'd given the documents for the wrong building, a simple mistake, but it was the wrong building. So without that verification, that building could have gone into use, actively into use, with no correct information. So again, what we're finding is that this happens more and more. What we are hoping to see with the Building Safety Act, and once construction companies and once managing agents and once accountable persons fully embrace the Building Safety Act, is that should start to disappear. That level of accountability should see that element start to disappear. So if we move on to the regulatory framework that we work in currently. So the last few years have been very a lot of turmoil, I think, a lot of confusion, but we've had some great pieces of legislation come through. So we've got the reform order from 2005. So since April 2006, we've been working to that, and we're happy with that. The Fire Safety Act 2021 revised that. It revised the scope of the RRO, and it clarified responsibilities of building owners. So it's a very important piece of legislation, the Fire Safety Act 2021. It extended the scope, and it asked fire risk assessors in particular to look at external walls for the first time. Why? Well, if we look at what happened at Grenfell, we can then start to unpick what went wrong. So this all ties into this secondary legislation with regarding materials that are combustible, and we put them on the outside of buildings. So now at fire risk assessment stage, under the Fire Safety Act 2021, we're asking our fire risk assessors to make a call on what's on the outside of that building. And if they're not sure, there's a process that we can follow here to get that external wall examined. And we can do a fire risk assessment of an external wall, an FRAEW, under a new or recently published specification, PAS 9980, to determine the risk, because buildings can have combustible cladding on the outside to a degree. It's the risk that's important, the way that building is managed, all of the other features of that building. It also looked at structural integrity for the first time in the Fire Safety Act. So, it looked, asking that assessor to look at that, to look at fire doors as well. So look at the doors, particularly, multi-occupied residential buildings, that flat front door is an incredible piece of passive fire safety, incredibly important. And again, go back to Grenfell, look at what went wrong and learn from those things that went wrong. All of those doors that didn't have self-closers on them, all those doors that have been replaced with UPVC, which would never hold back smoke and flame. We didn't stand a chance, but now we do. The Fire Safety Act 2021, your risk assessments now should be looking at those sorts of things. And then the Fire Safety England regulations 2022, England in brackets, is really interesting, as I'll touch on a bit later on, or the international thing is, this isn't necessarily UK-wide yet. So Fire Safety England regulations are very specific, but the Senedd and Wales are doing things slightly different, as are Scotland, as our Ireland, which is really, really interesting. And I think there's a little bit of a waiting game going on. For example, when I talked earlier on about the Building Safety Act applying to high-risk buildings, 18 metres plus, the Welsh Senedd have said, well, we don't have many of those, but the framework is sound, so we're going to apply it to 11-metre plus buildings. Very interesting, because that's got everybody talking about, well, what's the difference in risk between an 11-metre building and an 18-metre building? And if I'm honest, not a lot, really. number of people, the risk goes up slightly, but not a lot, not enough to exclude it from regulation, in my opinion. So the Fire Safety England regulators came in and they imposed additional fire safety measures, documented maintenance of fire safety equipment, clear evacuation plans, and really importantly, that understanding that residential and non-residential buildings alike share a lot of commonality and we shouldn't be splitting them necessarily in such a binary way. So we come to the Building Safety Act and what's it trying to do now? There's a synergy in those responsibilities that are key. Until we get everybody working together, we're never going to succeed in what we're trying to do here and make buildings safe. So the Building Safety Act places that duty of care on building owners. We've got to also look at the management of those buildings as well and how they work and how that synergy works. And those fire safety requirements, that need to be identified, assessed and managed effectively. Accountability stops at the top with the building owner. But without those managing agent support, it's going to be very, very difficult for them, is what we're finding. Enhanced oversight, this Building Safety Act is coming in and it's scrutiny, which is, again, as a safety professional working in the built environment, of course, this is what we want. We want the building safety regulators to succeed. They have our full support. They enforce the Building Safety Act. They look at how the Building Safety Act is aligning with other regulatory frameworks and fire safety frameworks. They, of course, have structural integrity as well as fire safety on their books now. So it becomes slightly interesting, which is why there is a push for a holistic approach to risk management of buildings. Now, this is the thing that I will shout loudest about, that holistic risk management. We have got to think about buildings in the whole. We've got to think about the way that the buildings, the way that the people, where humans interact with buildings. We've got to think about fire and structural risks together, not separately. And we've got to think about the life cycle of that building as well. Design, construction, management, demolition. We've got to think about all of those things. It's worth quickly at this point as well talking about what I describe as the two-body problem. And that is that we have a primary authority of fire rescue service, for example, saying your fire assessment is suitable and sufficient under the regulatory form fire safety order. Thank you very much. And then we might have the building safety regulator looking at the same fire risk assessment saying, no, it's not suitable and sufficient. Well, how can that be? Well, that's because they're looking at it from two different angles. The regulator, the building safety regulator, is looking at it from a holistic perspective. I'll talk more about that later on, but it's very interesting that we've got this regulatory framework that is still finding its feet and working together. So let's look at some of those risks that are emerging in buildings and residential buildings in particular. So we're talking about those types of fire, and again, all these stats are available from various fire and rescue services and the NFCC, the National Fire Chiefs Council, and we can see, the patterns that emerge in are very obvious to us potentially. Cooking equipment, unattended cooking equipment, grease build-up, flammable materials near stoves leading to fires. Kitchens are a primary risk area in residential buildings. So what I want you to start to think about now is actually, okay, where is that kitchen in this building? Okay, so let's look at the building as a whole. And then look at some electrical issues, so we've got potentially faulty wiring or overloaded outlets or malfunctioning appliances. The image in the background is Grenfell Tower post-fire. It started with a malfunctioning appliance causing an electrical fire, which led to the image that you can see there and the loss of those lives. We've also got the increasing risks of lithium-ion batteries, so people with their e-scooters bringing them into their homes and charging them using their electricity. Space heaters, fireplaces, that type of thing, if they're not maintained properly, it's an obvious risk. But what I'll draw your attention to there really is that most fires are happening in the building. Can we agree on that? That most of the fires are happening in the demised areas. They're not happening in the common parts. So go back to that two-body problem that I talked about there, where the fire and rescue service might be saying a fire risk assessment is actually okay. That fire risk assessment could be what we commonly know as a type 1, where when we're conducting that type of risk assessment, we're looking non-intrusively at the common parts of a building. That's all the RRO tells us to do. Whereas the Building Safety Act, for a higher risk building, the Building Safety tells us to do something different. So Section 156 of the Act goes a little bit further. And it looks at buildings holistically, and it tells you, look, the most important thing here is that we stop this happening again. How will we do that if we don't cross the threshold and go into the apartments and go into those units? And that's what's commonly known as a Type 3 fire risk assessment. That is a non-intrusive investigation into the common parts and the demised areas and how they work together. So most of the fires, statistically speaking, an incredibly high percentage of fires are starting in the demised areas. So for me, it's foolish to look at just the common parts. Now, the common parts are important. We do get fires there. Why? Because things like electricity, you think about the cost of electricity going up and up and up. And if you go and walk in any high-rise residential building, and most of them anyway, you're going to have electricity outside the apartments on the landings. It's just for the cleaners to use, for the hoovers, etc. And what that is perceived as is free electricity, isn't it? Because you can go and plug your e-scooter in out there, and that again brings that risk of lithium-ion batteries outside of the apartment front door. So what we're looking at here in terms of fire risk is a very, very interesting and emerging landscape, really, of that changing culture between people that would typically commission a Type 1 fire risk assessment to people who now understand, are property managers who now understand, and interestingly, accountable persons and principal accountable persons who say, I don't want that anymore. I want you to properly look at my building and look at the inside and the outside. That's integral to building safety, throughout the life cycle of a building, the regular assessment of those sorts of risks. So if we look, moving on to structural risks again, this is an area that again, I think it's easy to kind of now look at structural risks and talk about them, but pre-Building Safety Act, did we do that? I'm not so sure. And the structural engineers are on this call, we're saying, yes, of course we did. But as safety practitioners, did we really do that? So what are they? What's the impact of structural failure? So effectively, it's the inability of a building or a structure to support the intended loads. This can lead to a partial or a complete collapse of a building. How does it happen? Well, much the same way as fire, really. I think as soon as we start cutting corners with quality of materials, so material defects, maintenance as well. You can't just build a building, walk away, and it's going to be fine forever. It does need maintenance. There can be external forces, natural disasters, or impact from vehicles, that sort of thing. But taking those out of the equation, there's an awful lot we can do regarding the structural safety of buildings, and in particular disproportionate collapse. A disproportionate collapse is a situation where a minor failure leads to a cascading series of failures, causing a potentially catastrophic collapse. This is going to occur mainly where the structural design lacks that adequate redundancy in components. So we know things are going to fail. We know that they are going to wear out. So that redundancy needs to be built in, and we need to understand, how we account for that, how we account for load redistribution after a localized failure. In terms of those causes, we can look forever, but they always start with the design, unless there is a natural disaster. But even then, in buildings constructed in areas where earthquakes they're prone to earthquakes, you'll see that structural risk is considered very early on for those reasons. But if we look at some historic examples, you'll start to see, I think, a picture that we are starting to see as well, is that structural integrity is very much, it's a problem that still exists. So historically, we go back to the first one in the UK that kind of changed a lot of laws, if you like, was the Ronan Point disaster in 1968. So it was a gas explosion. It was a large panel system, an LPS building in London. A gas explosion, which was a very minor gas explosion, but it was a disproportionate collapse. So that led to several floors, and it led to a change in the building regulations and all those sorts of things that you thought it would do, but it didn't make the problem go away, and lessons weren't learned from that. And up until quite recently, the Champlain Towers South in Miami, which is a 12-story beachfront condo, which collapsed. And again, it was a partial collapse, disproportionate, loss of 98 people. That's the photograph you can see in the background of this slide. There was a loss of 98 people on that evening when that collapsed, 2021. So that brings it into sharp focus. So let's look at some of the strategies that we use already for managing these things. So risk assessment. I mean, let's always start with risk assessment. It is the bedrock of what we do. So regular evaluations to identify fire risk hazards, preventive measures, fire safety systems and practices, implementing those. Training. I can't stress enough, particularly now post-Grenfell, if you've got a building, whether it's a defend in place strategy or whether you've got a simultaneous or some form of evacuation to that building, if an alarm goes off and a sounder goes off and it's heard by occupants in the building, it's very unlikely that they're going to want to stay behind. So you've got to account for that. Human behaviour in emergency situations is a fascinating topic, and something that's very well documented, and something that we find as well. So training and letting people know what's going to happen in the event of an emergency is absolutely key. Those procedures that need to be followed are straightforward, but as long as they're clear, evacuation routes are clearly defined and response plans are clearly defined, essentially we're going to be okay. Maintenance, reactive plan, preventative maintenance, routine checks of fire safety equipment, all now enshrined in law under the depending where you are in the world, but the Fire Safety England regulations, for example, will ensure that you're checking these things in the right way and in the right timescales. Review and improvement. Let's never forget that we get this right, that's fine, but we need to keep reviewing. So, in terms of best practice, what do we look to and fall back on? Is that early detection and warning? Smoke detectors are. Smoke detection in and heat detection inside apartments is, you talk to your local fire and rescue service if you're not convinced yet. But while we're talking about it, make sure they're in your own home and go and check them. Electrical safety, as long as we're checking that the electrical safety systems are functioning correctly, we can then avoid overloading circuits and appliances as well. If we think about manufacturer recalls, how are we doing that? How are we monitoring in our high-rise buildings the appliances that are going in there? And if one of these develops a fault and gets a manufacturer's recall, how are we monitoring that? Comes into resident engagement. Structural risks. Design standards are there for a reason. They need to be used. Materials, high quality materials, not cheap materials. And we look at failures in structures, and it's nearly always that post-design replacement of a material. For what reason? For cost. So as soon as we start to do that, we start to see that kind of race to the bottom. We could build these things out of plywood, but it's not going to help the structure of the building. It just will be a bit cheaper. Routine inspections are crucial. That structural risk assessment, at least once a year, you're looking at the structure of that building and you're looking at the condition of the building. Load capacity structures, particularly for renovations, particularly if something changes in the usage of the building, you should be conducting load assessments so that they can safely support the new intended load. Monitoring systems, I'll touch on these a little bit later on as well. Monitoring systems are becoming really important now. To detect stress, vibration, etc. These can be absolutely key in the way we manage our buildings in the future. Construction practices needed to change, and they have in the large sector really been changing, but I still think there's work to be done here, and I'm sure many of us would agree. But foundation assessments, soil conditions, etc. These can be done retrospectively, but again, we go back and the problems really start at the design stage. So this is now part of Gateway 1, that foundation assessment. I touched earlier on that the component redundancy, building in a lifespan of these components, and when they go, what's going to happen? Are the other elements able to provide support? Retrofitting is happening an awful lot now, particularly when companies like ARC are getting involved and we're visiting buildings and we're looking structurally at the buildings, and now we're recommending retrofitting strategies so that a building's life cycle can be extended. Ongoing maintenance is crucial, obviously, throughout the life cycle of a building. From construction, and it just gets more and more important as that building gets older. So I'll quickly look at some other elements that I think are important when we're looking at building safety and structural in the built environment. The golden thread you may have heard of, it refers to this kind of this accessible record, a comprehensive and accessible record. Those two words are important: comprehensive and accessible. Building information for high-risk buildings. There's an awful lot of information there, particularly, if you're involved in the construction of buildings, you'll know that by the time you get to that handover point, it's absolutely crucial that you have some form of digital platform or database to manage that information. The design, construction, maintenance, safety records, real-time access is important. BIM, a lot of you will know BIM, again, from the early stages, from design, that building information modeling, will hopefully help buildings designed to create a 3D model. It helps you to track changes in the building, which is crucial. The Internet of Things, talking about the sensors, the monitoring sensors, when the fact that they can link up with each other now is crucial. Cloud-based technology has improved so that now we've got collaboration amongst stakeholders. Digital dashboards, what we say at ARC is 360-degree visibility is what you need. Automated reporting and compliance tracking, all of those things will lead to a fundamental kind of improvement, if you like, in the safety of the buildings. So stakeholders now, these new people that have come on board, this is really interesting now. Building owners and accountable persons, we're working more and more with them at ARC. So typically we would work with, earlier on in the chain, we were working with property managers. Now we're working with owners. It's an incredible journey that we're taking them on. They're accountable for these buildings and the management of the safety risks. So their appointment now of managing agents becomes a little bit more under scrutiny, so they're not going to go for the cheapest managing agent they can, because they're getting found out now. They're going to go for those managing agents that can actually help and support with the safety of their building. Developers and builders, of course, involved in the construction of buildings, adhering to the revised safety standards. Residents and tenants, if I can say it once, I'll say it again, that the voice of the residents and the tenants of these buildings is crucial, it's loud, and the regulator is listening. They're the people that are on the ground, they're in these buildings every day, and they have a right to safety, have a right to go to sleep in those buildings at night and wake up safely in the morning, and that's what we're here for. The local authorities still play an important role ensuring compliance, and we work with a lot of local authorities in that respect. The fire and rescue services aren't going anywhere. They are playing an enhanced role now in particularly ensuring standards are met, but also in education and those reach out movements of the local fire and rescue services. Anyone that lives or works in London know that the LFB are very keen to do that. And finally, the building safety regulator, very, very important. Part of the HSE, an independent body, but another huge stakeholder here. So what about the future, the anticipated trends? Well, of course, there's going to be more scrutiny. That goes without saying. There's going to be a focus on fire safety, and structural safety. That really is going to be an important part of how we get through this part of legislation and what comes next. I think the integration rather of digital technologies will be key. This was described very on when it was a bill as a digital first bill, and then a digital first act. They want this digitally. They understand, the regulator understands that we need clear, concise information, easily accessible and comprehensive. Accountability and responsibility as well, I think is only ever going to increase. I think we can talk all day about where we've come from, but it's where we're going that's really, really important. And I think these emerging technologies on safety standards are the things that are going to drive us. I think I touched on the Internet of Things earlier on, those monitors, those devices where smart buildings where a building can talk to you and talk to other parts of the building about what's going on. If you think about, self-testing of emergency lighting, linking to a fire alarm panel, all of these things are super exciting. The emergence of these sort of smart fire alarm systems, fire detection systems that have sensors and use AI and machine learning. Of course, things can go wrong here, and we're always going to need humans. But there's also emerging technologies in respect to materials that are being used. So you know, addressing the potential weaknesses. Now, cost is a huge issue, isn't it? You know, so bringing in new materials, new methods of construction, you know, modern methods of construction is something that, again, we could probably do a whole webinar on. But modern methods of construction, you know, that bring in new materials that are cheaper and safer is obviously where this is heading. You know, so will that be enshrined in legislation and regulation? Well, yes, I think it will, and I hope it does. So I'm coming to the end now. I'm just going to finally quickly look at it internationally, because what I've talked about here is a very broad subject of building safety. And as I've demonstrated, it doesn't apply even across the UK. But what about if you are, you know, an international member of IOSH? What does this mean to you? Well, I think there's a framework for safety regulations here. It provides a legislative model for establishing safety standards. I think that's a great thing. That model is done, and whilst it might not be perfect, the framework is absolutely sound. It brings in an enhanced risk management approach to living and working in tall buildings. It brings in proactive measures for identifying and managing risks you know, from construction, from design through to construction, through to management of the buildings. That can be applied globally. Stakeholder engagement is a really interesting one. So I think what we're finding in the UK is that stakeholders were initially surprised by this. You know, I'm talking about the accountable people. I'm talking about that kind of you know, transferring that internationally will be very, very, very interesting to watch unfold. Continuous improvement, yes, you know, I think that's what the Building Safety Act sets out to do. From its outset, it always set out to do that. That can be transferred. That's a very transferable part of this act. The whole thing is adaptable. These practices are adaptable. There are tall buildings across the world. There are tall buildings catching fire across the world. There are people's lives in danger across the world. The practices that we've set out in the UK with the Building Safety Act, I think are sound in principle. They will be developed and they will be even better. But ultimately, they're adaptable and they can be used globally. That's it for me. That is my final slide. So there's a QR code there which will take you, if you want more information about any of this or any of it broken down anymore, please reach out using that code. It will take you to a colleague of mine who can support and help. But from that, I think we've got 10, 15 minutes left for questions if anything has come in.
Yes, it's Simon. So thank you very much, Peter, for your very engaging and insightful talk and presentation on the Building Safety Act. Whilst people have been asking questions, both Christian and I have been typing frantically answers. We've got through quite a few. There's potentially two questions which may be worth just covering. The first one, if I may, was a lot of people are very interested in how to get a copy of Peter App's Show Me the Bodies.
Oh.
And I've been on one of Peter's seminars where he's presented in person, and I found it incredibly engaging to see his presentation. And he's a very, very good public speaker as well. And I rushed out and I bought a copy. It is available on Amazon. Do you have a copy?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
It's available on Amazon. What I would say, so this book is, in my opinion, anyway, is a real
Yes.
game changer, because what it sets out to do really, it has one agenda, and it's really to tell the story of what went wrong. And so what we did in the summer, we had a CPD day for our consultants. So we have, you know, fire risk consultants. We got them all in a room for a day. And one of the sessions, my colleague Shauna Thornton did an interview with Peter Apps. I think it's on LinkedIn. If you follow our page, you'll find it. So we invited Peter in to talk about. In fact, we kind of challenge. We're a bit of an organisation that likes to be a bit provocative, and so we entitled the session, "Are we really post Grenfell?" With, or are we, pre next Grenfell? And Peter was wonderful. He came in. So I bought a lot of these books. I think I bought about 50 or 60 of these, and we issue them to our consultants as reading material when they join our company. And I did it through the publisher. So I can put some details in about how I did that if people want, and they can get the books directly from Peter. I think he probably signed them for you as well. But I do, if one thing comes out of today, that if that book gets read, I think that's a really important thing.
It looks as though Nick Summers, thank you very much, Nick, for your questions and answers. It's Nick says that Peter Apps is speaking on one of the panel sessions at tomorrow's London Build 2024 Expo at Olympia. If any of you are going to Olympia to that event tomorrow, do please look out for Peter's presentation. It's very, very engaging, and I don't think you can come away without really understanding the enormity of both the scale of the tragedy and the innocence of people that were involved in that. And I personally, it was a wake-up call for me personally. So for the last 30 years, the general perception, general safety guidance has been about stay put. And who on earth wants to stay put in a fire? And it's the people who broke the rules that left and survived, and the people who were complying with the rules all perished. And sadly, there's a lot of soul searching in our profession when that happened, to revise everything that there is for us about safety. So the next question, there were two questions, and the second question is, to what extent are buildings inspected during the building stage rather than at practical completion? And the question goes on to say, poor workmanship, e.g. poor installation of cavity barriers, likely won't be visible just before handover. So this is an excellent question that addresses the crucial aspects of the building safety. The issue of inspection during the construction rather than at completion is indeed critical. And many of the construction companies focus on the project timeline and building the building using trades and not carrying out quality checks unless it's a public building or a public sponsored building or public infrastructure building. In the case of airports, railway lines, where there are independent inspectors checking quality of builds throughout. But when it's a private, when it tends to be a private investment with a principal contractor, all the requisite background checks have been carried out. The construction company is left to build and hand over. And throughout, there's not necessarily been the checks and balances throughout the builds to make sure that the build is achieved the requisite safety standards throughout, unless, of course, the company has put in an independent checks and commissioning process, which usually is very, very expensive and ensures that the build at the end of it is completed safely. So there is an increase focus on in-progress inspections, and the Hackett review conducted after the Grenfell Tower emphasised the need for more rigorous inspections. The Building Safety Act itself introduced the concept of gateways in the building, which you've covered. And then there are lots of control bodies, like the building control bodies, like local authority, building control, approved inspectors are increasingly conducting in-progress inspections. There's new roles and responsibilities, as you mentioned, that have been introduced in the Act. And also you have responsibilities throughout which apply to the principal designer and the principal contractor. And they have ongoing responsibilities after the construction process has been completed. And then in this day and age, there's digital record keeping, which has a growing emphasis on maintaining the golden thread of information, as you've mentioned, about the building, including photographic evidence, which has increasingly become available throughout the build to give a reassurance that at each stage there's as the build is gets to a particular phase, there's documentary evidence that it's met the standards. And then two more things. There's usually third-party verifications from, say, insurers, especially if the building has a particular warranty that insurers will take hold of. They'll make sure that, for example, fire safety elements are properly carried out throughout the build. And then finally, there's challenges. There's challenges to make improvements all the time, including embracing innovation and technical advantages. Speed of construction usually outpaces the inspection schedules, and then it relies on documentary evidence such as photographs, and then also the complexity of building systems that we have nowadays. So those are the two questions, Peter Apps and the question of around buildings inspections when buildings are being constructed. So two lively areas for constant potential review, and especially is anyone that has an opportunity to go to one of Peter Apps's presentations, please do get a copy of his book and do please go and enjoy his presentation. It's very refreshing to see how we are as an institute to affect people's lives through safety.
Yeah, I agree regarding Peter. He's yeah, we were lucky to get him and interview him, and yeah, he talks an awful lot of sense. And also, he has subscribed to his Substack. He writes for Inside Housing. Very interesting guy. And I think in terms of in terms of the inspections, I mean, I think the short answer is, how many is not enough. But there's a huge resource issue involved here as well. And you talked about kind of photographic evidence. We're coming more and more now up against or being supported by video and photographic evidence. So a responsible developer and constructor is going to document the construction of their building. Where you don't get that, be suspicious. So we write a lot at ARC. We write, FREWs. By their nature, they are intrusive, but I think, as the question asker said, you can't necessarily look at every single cavity barrier. But what you can do is you can sample, and then you can correlate that with video evidence to give you a degree of comfort that this building is safe. There is if it's okay, I saw another question come in, which I thought from Steve Jones, I thought was a really interesting one. And it's like, so what qualification now qualifies you as a fire risk assessor? Is it okay if I just quickly answer that?
Yes, absolutely.
But anyway, because it's a really simple answer. Nothing qualifies you as a fire risk assessor. So you can it's unregulated, So at ARC we self-regulate, and we look at all of our assessors are on the IFSM register, the three-tiered register. And so the qualification there's, Steve, that you mentioned, the level 4 fire safety practitioner, all of these things are incredibly valuable. So is the experience that, the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours of an individual. So the IFSM take that on board, and that will be that will manifest as a British standard before too long. We're hoping in 2025. So those 3 tiers are going to be recognised, from globally. And at ARC, we can't stress enough that if you're looking to commission this type of work, beware it is an unregulated industry. So look for the self-regulators, look for the companies that are registered. I have the consultants registered with people like IFSM, and they have accreditation to a recognised body like BAFE. So their fire risk assessment should be accredited, as should the people. So that's a slightly flippant answer to that, but effectively, we're at that point where competence in what we do needs to be challenged. But we have people that are looking all the time for signs and signals of competence, and it's just not there. So hopefully, if we run a similar session this time next year, we'll be talking about people being on that register as a legal requirement, but at the moment it's voluntary. Hopefully that answers that one, Steve.
Great, thank you, Peter. So thank you. A very, very engaging presentation, Peter. Thank you so much for presenting to our subcommittee and our joint subcommittees. That just leaves me to say thank you for everybody that attended. The session has been recorded. We will attempt to answer some more of your questions and put them into the links with this presentation, and do please share it widely with interested parties that can benefit from Peter's knowledge, and do reach out to Peter directly if indeed he can help you in your pursuit of the Building Safety Act. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.